The real threat to our league isn't money, it isn't ratings, or even missed calls, or even physical play. It's the lack of accountability from the league office.
Sue Bird was in stunned silence, her expression caught between disbelief and disappointment. Moments after Napheesa Collier's emotional press conference shook the WNBA world, cameras caught Bird's reaction, and it wasn't good. Some say it was about loyalty. Others whisper it's deeper, tied to a behind-the-scenes rift no one saw coming. Teammates looked uneasy, fans confused, as tension rippled through the league. So, what could have driven such a reaction from one of basketball's calmest legends? Because something sacred between them might have just shattered forever. Sue Bird watches, a new leader, rise. Sue Bird sat quietly as the cameras rolled, her eyes following every word that left Napheesa Collier's lips. The press conference wasn't just another media appearance, it felt like a turning point. For Bird, one of the most respected and experienced voices in women's basketball, this moment carried an unexpected emotional weight. She had seen countless stars come and go, but something about Collier's presence, her tone, her quiet authority, seemed to signal a shift in the rhythm of the WNBA itself. Napheesa Collier, the face of the Minnesota Lynx and one of the league's brightest young talents, was speaking about leadership, how it feels to step into the void left by veteran players who had shaped the team before her. She spoke with the calmness of someone far beyond her years, balancing honesty with poise. There was no rehearsed charm, no forced humility. Every sentence was deliberate, grounded, and sincere. And as Bird listened, she recognized something that could not be taught: the natural command of a true leader. Bird, known for her own composure both on and off the court, later reflected on how Collier handled that moment. What impressed her wasn't simply what Collier said, but how she carried herself. Her confidence wasn't loud, it was steady, like a heartbeat beneath pressure. It reminded Bird of the countless times she herself had stood before microphones, knowing that a single sentence could shape headlines, sway public opinion, or define an entire season's narrative. To Bird, a press conference is more than a formality. It's a reflection of how an athlete sees herself and her place in the sport. She understood the subtle power in those moments, how the right tone, the right expression, could connect a player to her fans and to the broader basketball community. Watching Collier, Bird saw someone who understood that balance instinctively, authentic yet composed, relatable yet authoritative. It was the kind of performance that quietly commands respect, not through flash, but through truth. Collier didn't shy away from difficult questions either. When asked about the challenges of leading a young team or navigating the expectations that come with being a franchise cornerstone, she responded with clarity and conviction. Her words reflected not only self-awareness, but also a vision for the future of women's basketball, a future Bird had spent decades fighting to build. For Bird, this wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. The calm strength, the composure under scrutiny, the refusal to let the moment overwhelm her. These were traits Bird had relied on throughout her own 20-year career. And now, watching Collier embody them with such natural grace, she felt both pride and a bittersweet ache. It was a quiet handover, a legend witnessing the rise of the next guardian of the game. Sue Bird's reaction wasn't about envy or nostalgia. It was about seeing the continuity of something sacred, a reminder that greatness in basketball isn't measured only in points or championships, but in the courage to lead, to speak, and to inspire those who follow. And as the cameras clicked and Collier's words echoed beyond the press room, Bird knew one thing for certain: the future of the WNBA had just found its next voice. So, what did Sue Bird really see that day? A passing of the torch, or the warning of a storm yet to come? Stay glued. Sue Bird reflects on the weight of speaking out. Sue Bird had seen it all: the triumphs, the heartbreaks, the defining moments that tested not just a player's skill, but their strength of character. But as she listened to Napheesa Collier speak about what had unfolded after Game 3, Bird sensed something deeper emerging beneath the usual rhythm of post-game analysis. This wasn't about a single night or a missed call. It was about the undercurrent that had long existed in the WNBA, one that pulsed with both frustration and determination. For Bird, Collier's comments revealed a truth she knew all too well. The moment may have started with the heat of competition, but the conversation went far beyond that. What happened in Game 3, Bird reflected, was only a small spark in a story that had been building for years, a story rooted in the struggle for recognition, fair treatment, and respect for the women who had poured their lives into this game. The issue didn't begin that night. It was simply brought into the light. Now in a unique position as part of team ownership, Bird treaded carefully with her words. There were limits to what she could say publicly, boundaries she had to respect. But what she could speak on was history, and that, she knew, spoke volumes. Time and again, when players in the WNBA had used their voices, real change followed. It had never been easy, and it was frustrating that progress so often depended on players being the ones to shout first, to demand attention before action was taken. But still, it worked. What struck Bird most was how often the public misunderstood this dynamic. Too many people, she thought, still viewed women's basketball through the lens of men's sports, assuming the same structures, the same privileges, the same systems of support. But the reality was different. The WNBA had always had to fight harder for the same respect, for the same recognition, for the same basic fairness. And when those in charge failed to listen quietly, the players learned to make their voices impossible to ignore. Social media had changed that battlefield, Bird observed. It gave players instant access to fans and the freedom to speak their truths without filters. Yet she also saw the difference between venting frustrations online and delivering a thoughtful, prepared statement that carried weight. That, she believed, was something uniquely powerful about the women in her league: the ability to turn emotion into organized, purposeful advocacy. She recalled how, time and again, players had tried to communicate concerns privately, only to be dismissed or delayed. Eventually, they'd learned that the public stage was sometimes the only place that made the league pay attention. And this, Bird thought, wasn't rebellion. It was accountability. One moment stood out to her from the season. It came not from Collier, but from Paige Buchers, a young guard wise beyond her years. Before a game in Indiana, Paige had turned to her teammates and said something that stuck with Bird. "I've had to learn how to defend while fouling again." It was said, half-jokingly, but beneath the humor lay exhaustion, a quiet acknowledgement of the inconsistencies, the unspoken struggles that players endured just to adapt. For Bird, it crystallized everything: the frustration, the resilience, the endless effort to be heard. The WNBA wasn't just a league, it was a movement built on persistence. And as she watched this new generation rise to speak out with the same courage she once had, Bird realized the cycle wasn't ending. It was evolving. The torch had truly been passed, and with it, the responsibility to keep pushing until real, lasting change took root. And what happens when the fight for fairness outgrows the court itself, forcing legends and newcomers alike to redefine what justice means? Stay tuned. When fairness demands a voice. Sue Bird had heard countless post-game reflections throughout her career, but Paige Buchers' words stayed with her longer than most. Before a game in Indiana, the young star had spoken candidly about how much her defensive mindset had shifted since leaving college. In school, she explained, everything had been about learning how to defend without fouling, about precision, restraint, and control. But in the WNBA, she'd realized something very different. To survive here, she said, you had to learn how to defend while fouling. Bird didn't hear bitterness in Paige's voice, only honesty. There was no hidden motive, no attempt to stir controversy. Paige was describing a reality that every player recognized, but few were willing to say out loud. Those years when she used to joke that she'd played in the '90s NBA. It was her way of capturing the sheer physicality that had defined her era, a time when elbows flew freely and bodies collided like tectonic plates beneath the basket. The game had evolved since then, but Bird understood what Paige meant. Every generation learns its own form of survival. Still, Bird's reflections weren't about blame. She had no interest in turning officials into scapegoats. In fact, she often felt sympathy for them. Their job, she knew, was one of the hardest in sports. Split-second decisions, constant pressure, endless scrutiny. Every whistle echoed louder now in an era where every mistake was replayed, dissected, and magnified across social media. The growing negativity, she thought, had unfairly settled on their shoulders. The problem, as Bird saw it, wasn't about individual referees. It was systemic. Across nearly every team, players and coaches were noticing the same inconsistencies, the same confusion about how physical play was being judged. The frustration wasn't about a single call or a single game. It was about a pattern that was shaping how the sport felt to play. Bird believed there was a simple but crucial step that could begin to heal that rift: acknowledgement. Not silence, not defensiveness, just the willingness of those in power to say, "We hear you." Whether it came from the commissioner's office, the officiating department, or the competition committee, a public statement recognizing the players' concerns would go a long way, because beneath all the frustration was a simple human need to be heard. Bird knew that even if the league was already working behind the scenes to address these issues, saying so openly would have mattered. Transparency, she thought, was a form of respect. It told players that their experiences weren't being dismissed, that their struggles weren't invisible. As she reflected on it all, the comments from Collier, the candor from Buchers, the conversations echoing through locker rooms, Bird recognized that the heart of the issue wasn't about officiating at all. It was about connection, communication, and trust between those who played the game and those who governed it. And as someone who had spent decades watching the WNBA fight for its own recognition, she knew this was another moment that would test how much the league truly listened when its players spoke. But how did a simple debate about whistles and fouls unravel into a deeper question about power, trust, and who truly controls the game? Keep watching. Whistles and boundaries. How the rules shape the game. Sue Bird leaned back, thinking about how many times she had seen a single whistle change the rhythm of a game, a season, even a career. The discussion about officiating wasn't abstract to her. It was something she had lived, felt, and adjusted to across decades of professional play. When the conversation circled back to Paige Buchers and the way players had to adapt defensively, Bird felt the need to expand on something deeper: how refereeing itself shaped not just games but playing styles, instincts, and confidence. She remembered it clearly: the U.S. women's national team's college tour that took place just before the world shut down. It was the fall of 2019, running into the winter of 2020. Those exhibition games against top college programs were meant to prepare Team USA for international play, but they also brought unexpected challenges. Everyone still talked about the loss to Oregon, though Bird preferred to set that memory aside for the moment. What mattered more was what those games revealed. In those matchups, USA basketball had agreed to play under college rules and with college referees. On paper, that didn't seem like a major shift. In reality, it completely changed the feel of the game. Bird and her teammates, some of the best and most experienced players in the world, suddenly had to unlearn habits that had carried them through entire careers. They couldn't hand-check. They couldn't initiate contact in the same way. They had to move, defend, and react differently because the officials enforced the game with another philosophy entirely. Bird remembered the frustration that came with that adjustment. The same refs, sometimes even the very same individuals, could call a WNBA game one way and a college game another. That, to her, was the clearest proof that officiating wasn't fixed. It was flexible. Referees followed the tone set by the institutions above them, the powers that be. The standard could shift, and players had no choice but to follow. For Bird, that realization carried a powerful truth. If the officiating culture could change from one setting to another, then it could change within the WNBA too. It wasn't about blaming officials, it was about acknowledging their influence and the structure guiding them. Players, she often said, will play the way refs allow. If physical play is permitted, athletes adapt. If touch fouls are emphasized, they'll adjust to that too. The referees, in a very real sense, define the boundaries of the game. She spoke with genuine empathy for officials. Bird knew their job was grueling, split-second calls, unrelenting pressure, every decision filmed, slowed down, and scrutinized. She didn't envy them, but she also knew that their approach could shape outcomes in ways that went far beyond the scoreboard. That was what fascinated her most. The system could evolve. It already had across leagues and levels. Change didn't need to happen overnight, but it was possible, and in her view, necessary. Because when players like Collier or Buchers found themselves adjusting not to strategy, but to inconsistency, the game itself suffered. Bird wondered aloud what one small change, one deliberate adjustment, might look like if it were applied in the finals. Could one consistent standard, one cleaned-up area of officiating, restore balance? She didn't have a simple answer, but she knew this much. Basketball's fairness, its flow, and its beauty depended as much on the rules that governed it as on the players who lived by them. And as her words echoed, one question lingered: could the game's chaos truly be fixed, or had fairness already slipped beyond reach? Stay with us. A game caught in the grip. From Sue Bird's perspective, the conversation wasn't just about a single play or one night's officiating. It was about the very heartbeat of the game itself. Watching from the sidelines, she could feel it. The tension between freedom and restraint, between skill and suppression. There was something off about the rhythm of the WNBA lately, something that didn't sit right with her trained eye. She'd seen it unfold countless times, players struggling not because of poor form or strategy, but because they were being physically held, grabbed or blocked off the ball in ways that stifled movement and broke the natural flow of the game. 2 hands, she thought. 2 hands stopping brilliance. It wasn't just rough defense. It was interference with the artistry that made the sport beautiful. Sue knew she wasn't alone in her frustration. Becky Hammon had voiced similar concerns, echoing what so many veterans felt but rarely said aloud. And now, thanks to Caitlin Clark's arrival, those quiet frustrations had been magnified for the entire world to see. Strangely, Caitlin had become a mirror, reflecting every flaw, every overlooked habit that had been quietly tolerated within the league for years. Fans who had just discovered the WNBA were beginning to ask the same questions Sue had asked for decades. They watched, wide-eyed and puzzled. Wait, how is that not a foul? The more they looked, the more they noticed. What should have been moments of fluid, skillful motion were being interrupted by clutches, bumps, and grips that went unnoticed by officials. To Sue, it wasn't about favoritism or rule changes. It was about integrity. The league couldn't showcase its best talent if its stars weren't free to move, to play, to create. The conversation, she believed, needed to start with freedom of movement. But it couldn't end there. The real challenge was deeper. How could the WNBA invest in developing the best officials in the world? How could it ensure that every whistle, every call, reflected not just consistency, but a respect for the game's evolving brilliance? For Sue Bird, it wasn't merely about what was happening on the court, it was about what kind of league the WNBA wanted to become. And beneath her calm tone was a growing urgency. If the game didn't adapt soon, the cost might not just be unfair play, it might be the erosion of its very soul. And how can a league truly thrive if its brightest stars are shackled by flawed officiating? What future does that create? The cost of losing control. According to Sue Bird, the issue was no longer just about physical contact on the court. It had become a question of what kind of future the WNBA was building for itself. She could see the cracks forming, not because the referees lacked skill, but because of the system that governed them. Some nights, the game was allowed to devolve into a wrestling match, while on others, it flowed freely, guided by a tighter whistle. The inconsistency gnawed at her, not because she doubted the referee's abilities, but because she knew they were capable of more. What unsettled her most was the realization that many of these same officials worked both the college and professional levels. In college, they enforced stricter standards called fouls that maintained rhythm and allowed players to showcase their full talent. But in the WNBA, those same referees often seemed bound by different instructions, different mandates. It wasn't about skill, it was about what the league allowed, what it prioritized, and what it chose to overlook. And then there was the problem no one wanted to say out loud, but every veteran had seen. The league's best referees never stayed for long. They were plucked by the NBA, drawn by bigger paychecks and higher-profile games. The talent pipeline wasn't broken, it was drained, siphoned away by a system that placed women's sports second, not first. For Sue, it was a bitter truth, one she had watched play out not just in officiating, but everywhere. Trainers, marketing experts, public relations specialists, even broadcasters, women's leagues developed them, only to lose them to the men's side when the money came calling. That cycle, she believed, wasn't just unfair, it was unsustainable. How could the WNBA grow into its full potential if every investment in excellence was eventually handed off to someone else? The question wasn't only about better rules or stricter whistles, it was about building a structure that valued and retained the best from the floor to the front office. Sue knew pointing out the problems was easier than solving them. She admitted it herself. But she also believed that real progress required facing the uncomfortable truths: freedom of movement, consistency in officiating, and above all, a commitment to keeping the brightest talent within the women's game. Otherwise, the league risked not just losing control of its flow, but losing control of its future. So what do you think? Can the WNBA ever break free from inconsistent officiating and the drain of its best talent, or will history repeat itself? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.